At first glance, the case against singer D4VD appears almost impossible to defend. The decomposed and dismembered remains of 14-year-old Celeste Rivas Hernandez were discovered inside the front trunk of a Tesla registered to him. Prosecutors say DNA matching Celeste was found on multiple objects inside the garage of his Hollywood Hills home. They also presented records showing that items including chainsaws, a body bag, a shovel, and an inflatable pool were allegedly ordered after Celeste arrived at that property. Then there were the text messages. Messages that prosecutors say revealed an illegal relationship between an adult musician and a vulnerable young girl. Messages filled with conflict, threats, fear, pregnancy, and the possibility that Celeste could expose a secret capable of destroying a rapidly growing music career. After 5 days of testimony, a Los Angeles judge ruled that prosecutors had presented enough evidence to take David Anthony Burke, known professionally as D4VD, to trial. For many people following the case, that decision appeared to confirm what they already believed. The evidence looked overwhelming, but a preliminary hearing is not a murder trial. The judge was not being asked to decide whether Burke was guilty beyond a reasonable doubt. The question was only whether enough evidence existed for the charges to continue. At the eventual trial, prosecutors will face a much heavier burden, and that difference may become the center of the defense strategy. Because Burke's lawyers may not need to persuade a jury that nothing disturbing happened inside that Hollywood Hills home. They may not need to deny every purchase, every message, every DNA result, or even every act allegedly committed after Celeste died. They may instead ask one narrower and far more dangerous question. Can the prosecution prove that David Burke was the person who actually killed her? That question does not make the evidence less horrifying. It does not reduce Celeste to a legal argument. She was a child whose life ended violently, and whose remains were hidden for months before being discovered in a vehicle. But criminal trials are not decided only by the horror of what investigators find. They are decided by what prosecutors can prove about who committed each specific crime, when it happened, how it happened, and with what intent. Burke has pleaded not guilty. His attorneys have publicly stated that the evidence will show he did not murder Celeste and was not responsible for causing her death. That statement leaves open an important possibility. The defense may attempt to separate the alleged killing from the alleged treatment of Celeste's body afterward. In other words, Burke's attorneys could argue that evidence connecting him to the concealment or mutilation of the remains does not automatically prove that he inflicted the fatal injuries. It would be a deeply controversial defense, but it would not be unprecedented. American juries have previously been asked to consider cases in which a defendant admitted cutting apart or hiding a body while denying murder. The defense could argue that conduct after a death may prove panic, fear, obstruction, or an attempt to avoid responsibility for another crime, but it does not necessarily establish who caused the death itself. That distinction may sound impossible to accept emotionally. Legally, however, it matters. Prosecutors say Celeste arrived at Burke's home on April 23, 2025, and was never seen alive again. They allege he fatally stabbed her, placed her body inside an inflatable pool, and used a chainsaw to dismember her. The Los Angeles County medical examiner determined that Celeste died from multiple penetrating injuries and classified her death as a homicide. That is powerful evidence that Celeste was killed. But the defense will likely examine every limitation created by decomposition, the passage of time, and the condition in which her body was discovered. Her remains were not found immediately after her death. They were discovered months later, after the Tesla had been abandoned and taken to a tow yard. The delay may have destroyed or degraded evidence that could have established a more precise timeline. That creates room for competing experts. At trial, the prosecution may call medical examiners and forensic specialists who will explain why Celeste's wounds demonstrate homicide and why the physical evidence points toward Burke. The defense can hire its own forensic pathologists. Those experts may not need to prove an entirely different cause of death. They may only need to challenge how confidently the prosecution can identify the fatal sequence, the precise time of death, or the person who inflicted each wound. If one qualified expert tells the jury that the evidence cannot establish those facts with medical certainty, the defense gains something valuable: reasonable doubt. The DNA testimony presents a similar problem. A forensic expert testified that DNA recovered from several locations in Burke's garage strongly matched Celeste. The statistical strength of the match was described as extraordinarily high, but under cross-examination, the expert reportedly acknowledged an important limitation. The testing could identify Celeste's genetic material, but it could not always determine exactly what biological substance produced it, when it was deposited, or how it reached each object. For prosecutors, Celeste's DNA inside the garage supports their theory that violence and dismemberment occurred there. For the defense, the same result may prove only that Celeste had been inside the property. That difference will become critical because evidence must be interpreted within a timeline. If Celeste had spent time at the home before her death, her DNA could have been left there during an earlier visit. The prosecution will therefore need more than the presence of DNA. It will need to connect the location, the suspected blood evidence, the purchased equipment, the condition of the remains, and Burke's actions into one coherent sequence. The prosecution's theory is direct. Celeste was involved in an illegal sexual relationship with Burke. She allegedly threatened to expose that relationship. Exposure could have ended his career, cost him money, and subjected him to criminal prosecution. Prosecutors say he invited her to his home, killed her to silence her, and then attempted to destroy and conceal the evidence. The criminal complaint includes allegations that the murder was committed for financial gain, by lying in wait, and to kill a witness. Those special circumstances could make the case eligible for the death penalty, although prosecutors have not announced a final decision on whether they will seek it. California currently has a moratorium on executions, but a death penalty prosecution can still have enormous consequences long before sentencing. It can shape jury selection. Potential jurors who say they could never consider the death penalty may be removed from a capital case. Defense attorneys often argue that this process can produce a jury more receptive to the prosecution. The threat of capital punishment can also increase pressure during plea negotiations, but in this case, that pressure may not be enough. If the only offer is life in prison without the possibility of parole, Burke's attorneys may conclude that he has little to lose by taking the case before a jury. Even if the prosecution's story is disturbing, a trial would give the defense the opportunity to challenge every assumption that appeared persuasive during the preliminary hearing. The text messages may become one of the most unpredictable parts of that battle. Prosecutors are expected to use them to establish the relationship, the imbalance of power, Burke's possible motive, and Celeste's fear that she had become a threat to his future. But the defense may argue that the complete message history tells a more complicated story than the selections initially presented in court. Some messages reportedly included threats, emotional outbursts, references to other people, and statements that could be interpreted in multiple ways. The defense might use those messages to introduce the possibility of a third person. It might argue that someone else had a motive to confront Celeste. It could suggest that Burke helped conceal what happened because he was protecting another individual, protecting his career, or trying to hide the illegal relationship. Introducing another possible suspect would not require the defense to prove that person committed the killing. The defense would only need to persuade jurors that investigators failed to eliminate reasonable alternatives. However, there is a serious danger in using that strategy. A weak third-party theory can look like desperation. Jurors may reject it if it is based only on vague messages or speculation. The judge may also limit evidence about another person unless the defense can show a meaningful connection to the crime. The defense faces another major problem. Even if jurors question who delivered the fatal wounds, Burke's alleged behavior after Celeste disappeared may appear extremely difficult to explain innocently. Prosecutors say that after she arrived at his home, equipment associated with digging containing a body and cutting material was ordered under an alias. They allege blue plastic fragments from the inflatable pool were later discovered embedded in Celeste's remains. Her body was eventually found in Burke's Tesla. This is not one suspicious fact standing alone. It is a chain of evidence. The prosecution will argue that the purchases demonstrate planning and consciousness of guilt. The pool, the chainsaws, the body bag, the condition of the remains, the garage evidence, and the abandoned vehicle all point toward the same person. The defense must either break that chain or change what it means. One option would be to concede some involvement after Celeste's death while denying murder. That would be an extraordinary risk. Admitting that a defendant concealed or mutilated a child's remains could make jurors hate him before they ever consider the murder charge. It would also expose him to serious punishment for the conduct he admits. But such a concession might give the defense credibility. Rather than denying facts that seem impossible to deny, the attorneys could tell the jury that Burke committed terrible acts after Celeste died, but that the government is using those acts to fill a gap in its proof of murder. The message would be simple: do not confuse what happened to the body with proof of who caused the death. The prosecution would respond that the distinction is artificial. Why would an innocent person possess the victim's body, obtain equipment associated with dismemberment, leave her remains in his vehicle, and remain silent for months? Why would all of that happen immediately after the victim allegedly threatened to expose a secret relationship? Why would Celeste disappear after entering Burke's home and never be seen alive again? The prosecution does not need a video of the killing or a confession. Murder cases are frequently proven through circumstantial evidence. A jury is allowed to consider multiple facts together and decide whether they lead to one reasonable conclusion. That may be the prosecution's greatest strength. No single piece of evidence must carry the entire case. The text messages may establish motive. The timeline may establish opportunity. The purchases may establish preparation and concealment. The DNA may establish location. The condition of the remains may establish what occurred after death. And the Tesla may connect the final stage of concealment directly to Burke. When those pieces are combined, prosecutors will argue that the possibility of an unknown killer becomes unreasonable. But the defense does not have to solve the case. It does not have to identify the true killer. It does not have to explain every disturbing detail. Its job is to expose weaknesses in the prosecution's story and persuade at least one juror that the state has not eliminated reasonable doubt. That is why the upcoming trial may be far less straightforward than the preliminary hearing appeared. The preliminary hearing showed what the prosecution wants the public to see. It presented the broad framework of a case that investigators have spent months building. The full trial will reveal what the defense has been saving. Independent forensic experts may challenge the medical findings. Complete message records may change the meaning of selected conversations. The defense may question how evidence was collected, why certain objects were tested while others were not, and whether investigators focused too quickly on one suspect. It may also explore contradictions involving the adults who knew about Celeste's relationship and allegedly allowed her to travel with Burke. None of those issues excuses what happened to Celeste. She was a child surrounded by adults who should have protected her. The most important fact must never be lost beneath the celebrity name, courtroom strategy, or graphic evidence. Celeste Rivas Hernandez was 14 years old when her remains were found. Prosecutors say the abusive relationship began years earlier, while she was even younger. At trial, Burke's attorneys may argue that Celeste was emotionally troubled, that some of her messages were threatening, or that her relationship with other people creates uncertainty about the final hours of her life. But attacking Celeste personally could backfire. A jury may see those messages not as evidence against her, but as evidence of a child struggling inside a situation she was too young to control. The defense therefore faces a delicate task. It must challenge the prosecution's version of events without appearing to blame a child for her own death. The prosecution faces an equally important burden. It must prove more than that Burke behaved horribly, more than that he was involved in an illegal relationship, and more than that he may have participated in concealing a body. It must prove beyond a reasonable doubt that he committed the murder charged in the complaint and that the alleged special circumstances are true. The judge has already ruled that enough evidence exists for the case to continue. Now the real legal battle begins. Will the prosecution's evidence become even stronger when jurors see the full case? Or will the defense expose gaps that were hidden beneath the shock of the preliminary hearing? Could David Burke admit involvement in the destruction and concealment of Celeste's body, while still convincing a jury that someone else caused her death? And if that becomes the defense, will jurors carefully separate the charges as the law requires? Or will the evidence of what happened after Celeste died make any claim of innocence impossible to believe? The answers will determine not only whether D4VD spends the rest of his life in prison, but whether prosecutors can transform a deeply disturbing collection of evidence into proof beyond a reasonable doubt. The defense would face an immediate problem with that argument. Even if the prosecution cannot place a weapon in Burke's hand at the exact moment Celeste was killed, jurors are allowed to consider the complete pattern of evidence. They do not have to examine every purchase, every message, and every forensic result in isolation. They can look at the entire sequence. Prosecutors say Celeste arrived at Burke's Hollywood Hills residence and was never seen alive again. They say she had threatened to reveal an illegal relationship that could have destroyed his career and exposed him to criminal charges. Soon afterward, items that could be used to contain, cut, move, or conceal a body were allegedly purchased. Celeste's biological material was later detected inside the garage. Her dismembered remains were eventually discovered inside a Tesla registered to Burke. The prosecution will argue that all of those facts point in one direction. The defense will attempt to make them point in several. One of the most important battles may involve the timing of Celeste's death. Because her body was discovered months after she disappeared, decomposition may have made it difficult to determine the precise hour, or even the exact day she died. That uncertainty could matter if several people had access to the home, the garage, the Tesla, or the equipment allegedly used after her death. The defense may ask who entered and left the property during that period. It may examine security footage, phone location data, vehicle records, digital messages, and the movements of every person connected to Burke and Celeste. If another individual was present near the time prosecutors believe Celeste was killed, the defense could use that person to create an alternative explanation. But merely showing that someone else was nearby would not be enough. To introduce a serious third-party suspect, Burke's attorneys would likely need evidence connecting that person to the crime. That could include threats, fingerprints, DNA, location records, possession of relevant tools, or messages revealing knowledge that only the killer would have. Without such evidence, the jury may see the argument as an attempt to create confusion rather than reasonable doubt. The text messages could become the foundation of both sides' cases. Prosecutors are expected to argue that Burke had a powerful motive to silence Celeste. According to the case presented at the preliminary hearing, the relationship exposed him to enormous personal, professional, and legal consequences. The messages allegedly revealed arguments about pregnancy, abortion, jealousy, money, and threats to expose what had been happening. For the prosecution, those messages may demonstrate escalating pressure. They could argue that Celeste had become unpredictable from Burke's perspective. She knew information that could ruin him. She could contact his family, his management, the police, or the public. If prosecutors convinced jurors that Burke believed his entire future was in danger, the messages could help explain why he might have decided to kill her. The defense will likely present a different interpretation. It may argue that the messages show two emotionally unstable people involved in a chaotic and deeply inappropriate relationship, but not a planned murder. The attorneys may highlight statements in which Celeste threatened Burke, threatened herself, referred to other individuals, or described conflicts that had nothing to do with him. They may argue that prosecutors selected only the messages supporting their theory while ignoring conversations that weaken it. That is why the complete digital record will matter. A single message can sound devastating when removed from the conversation surrounding it. A defense attorney may show what was written immediately before and after that message, who initiated the exchange, and whether the words were serious, emotional, manipulative, or simply part of an ongoing argument. But the defense must be careful. Celeste was a child. Attempts to describe her as aggressive, unstable, sexually experienced, or responsible for the relationship could cause serious damage in front of a jury. Even if some messages contain threats or angry language, jurors may view them as the words of a vulnerable child who had been drawn into a relationship with a much older and more powerful adult. The prosecution may call experts on child grooming and coercive control. Those experts could explain why a minor may repeatedly return to an abusive relationship, defend the adult involved, hide information from family members, or send contradictory messages. They may tell jurors that such behavior does not mean the child was in control. It may mean the opposite. The defense will likely challenge those experts by arguing that they cannot testify about what Burke or Celeste personally intended. They may explain general patterns, but they were not present in the relationship and cannot read either person's mind. Still, this evidence could make it extremely difficult for the defense to use Celeste's messages without appearing to blame her. Another major issue will be the alleged purchases. Prosecutors reportedly presented evidence involving chainsaws, an inflatable pool, a shovel, a body bag, and other equipment. The timing of those purchases may be more important than the objects themselves. Many household items can have innocent uses. A shovel does not prove murder. A chainsaw does not prove dismemberment. An inflatable pool does not prove that a body was placed inside it. But when those items are purchased close to a disappearance, delivered to a relevant location, and later connected to physical evidence found with the victim, their meaning changes. Prosecutors may argue that the purchases reveal preparation. The defense may argue that they reveal only what happened after Celeste was already dead. That distinction could become the center of the case. Suppose the defense claims Burke returned home and discovered Celeste dead. Suppose it claims someone else killed her, and Burke panicked because he knew the illegal relationship would make him the obvious suspect. Under that theory, Burke may have chosen to conceal the body rather than call the police. That would still describe serious criminal conduct. But the defense could argue that fear and panic explain the purchases without proving murder. Prosecutors would then ask the obvious question. Why would an innocent person protect the real killer? Why would he dismember a child's body, hide it in his own vehicle, and remain silent while her family searched for her? The defense would need an answer powerful enough to overcome the natural reaction of almost every juror. One possibility would be that Burke was protecting another person. Another would be that he believed admitting the illegal relationship would destroy his life, even if he had not committed the killing. But every explanation creates another problem. If Burke knew who killed Celeste and helped conceal the crime, why did he not eventually tell investigators? If he was frightened, why did he continue the concealment for months? If another person controlled or threatened him, where is the evidence of that pressure? The prosecution will argue that the simplest explanation is also the correct one. Burke had the motive. Burke had the opportunity. The body was found in Burke's vehicle. The alleged concealment equipment was connected to his residence, and the victim disappeared after entering his world. The defense will respond that criminal cases cannot be decided simply because one explanation appears more disturbing or more obvious. The law requires proof beyond a reasonable doubt. That means prosecutors must eliminate reasonable alternatives, not every imaginary possibility. A theory involving an unknown killer with no evidence will not be enough. But a theory supported by digital records, forensic inconsistencies, missing evidence, or another person's documented presence could create a genuine problem. This is why the forensic experts may determine the outcome. The prosecution's pathologist will likely explain why the wounds occurred while Celeste was alive, which injuries were fatal, and whether the pattern is consistent with an intentional attack. The defense experts may challenge how much can be concluded from remains that were severely decomposed and dismembered. They may question whether every wound was inflicted before death. They may ask whether damage caused during dismemberment could be confused with injuries from the original attack. They may dispute the sequence of events. And if the experts disagree, jurors must decide which interpretation is more reliable. That decision could separate a murder conviction from convictions only for crimes committed after Celeste's death. But the prosecution has one powerful advantage. Circumstantial evidence does not become weak merely because no eyewitness saw the killing. In many murder cases, there is no confession, no surveillance video, and no witness present during the final moments. Prosecutors build their cases from behavior, motive, opportunity, forensic evidence, and attempts to hide the crime. The law allows jurors to convict on circumstantial evidence, if the combined proof leaves no reasonable doubt. Burke's defense, therefore, cannot simply point out that nobody saw him kill Celeste. It must show why the prosecution's entire chain cannot be trusted. And that may be far more difficult than attacking one photograph, one text message, or one forensic test. The possibility of the death penalty adds another layer of strategy to this case. Los Angeles County prosecutors have alleged special circumstances that could make Burke eligible for capital punishment. But eligibility does not mean the district attorney has made a final decision to seek death. That decision could affect almost every stage of the case. In a death penalty trial, potential jurors may be questioned about whether they could consider imposing death if Burke were convicted. People whose beliefs would prevent them from following the law in a capital case may be removed. Defense attorneys often argue that this process creates a jury more favorable to the prosecution. A person who strongly opposes the death penalty may also be more skeptical of police, more cautious about convicting, or more willing to consider mitigating circumstances. Removing that person can change the balance of the jury before the first witness is called. The prosecution would reject the suggestion that capital charges are being used only as a jury selection tool. It would argue that the alleged facts justify the most serious punishment available under California law. The victim was a child. The prosecution alleges that she was killed to prevent her from exposing an illegal sexual relationship. It also alleges that the crime involved planning, financial motive, concealment, and the destruction of her body. If jurors accept that theory, prosecutors may argue that the case represents exactly the kind of conduct for which special circumstances were created. But the practical reality of the death penalty in California is complicated. Executions are not currently being carried out. The state's death penalty system has faced years of legal, political, and administrative obstacles. That means a death sentence might never result in an execution. Even so, the threat remains powerful. It can increase pressure on the defendant to accept a plea agreement. It can extend the trial, increase legal costs, and expose the defense to a more prosecution-friendly jury selection process. The district attorney could offer Burke life in prison without the possibility of parole in exchange for a guilty plea. For many defendants facing a possible death sentence, that could be a reason to avoid trial. But Burke's calculation may be different. If the best offer still requires him to spend the rest of his life in prison, his attorneys may believe there is little advantage in pleading guilty. A trial would at least give them the opportunity to challenge the forensic evidence, contest the prosecution's timeline, introduce another possible participant, and attempt to reduce the case from murder to offenses connected to concealment or abuse. That does not mean a plea agreement is impossible. The prosecution could offer to remove the special circumstances or reduce some charges. Burke could plead guilty to murder in exchange for avoiding a capital prosecution. He might also seek an agreement that limits how certain allegations are described in court or at sentencing. But any agreement would be politically and emotionally difficult. Celeste's family may demand a full trial. The public may view any reduction as leniency toward an adult accused of abusing and killing a child. The district attorney would have to explain why a negotiated resolution better serves justice than presenting the entire case to a jury. The defense would face its own problem. A guilty plea would eliminate the opportunity to argue that Burke did not cause Celeste's death. It would permanently attach his name to the murder and likely end any remaining possibility of reclaiming his career or public reputation. That is why the decision may depend on evidence that has not yet been revealed publicly. The defense team has access to discovery materials that the public has not seen. Those materials may include complete phone extractions, surveillance footage, interviews, search histories, financial records, DNA reports, and statements from people connected to the case. If those records strongly support the prosecution, Burke's lawyers may eventually recommend a plea. If they reveal gaps, contradictions, or another person's involvement, the defense may be willing to take the risk of trial. One of the most important questions will be whether Burke made any statements to investigators. A confession would transform the case. An admission that he killed Celeste, even if followed by a claim of self-defense or accident, would give prosecutors direct evidence of responsibility. But an ambiguous statement could become a battle over interpretation. Burke may have admitted knowing where the body was without admitting murder. He may have denied involvement, but provided details investigators believe only a participant could know. The defense could argue that statements were taken out of context, made under pressure, or misunderstood. It could also challenge whether police followed proper procedures during questioning. If investigators continued an interrogation after Burke clearly requested an attorney, or if a search exceeded the limits of a warrant, the defense could attempt to suppress important evidence. There is currently no public indication that a judge has excluded any major evidence, but pre-trial motions have not yet revealed the full scope of the legal challenges Burke's attorneys may bring. Those motions could become almost as important as the trial itself. The defense may seek to prevent jurors from seeing the most graphic photographs. It could argue that certain images are more prejudicial than informative, especially if several photographs show the same injuries. Prosecutors would respond that the condition of Celeste's remains is necessary to explain the medical findings, the method of dismemberment, and the connection between the body and the equipment allegedly purchased. The judge would have to decide whether each image helps prove a disputed fact or simply inflames the jury. The defense may also try to exclude evidence about Burke's music, public image, finances, or private life if it is not directly connected to the charged crimes. The prosecution may argue that his career and financial future provide the motive. If Celeste threatened to expose the relationship, the potential loss of fame, income, touring opportunities, and record contracts could explain why prosecutors believe Burke wanted to silence her. That creates a narrow line. The prosecution can present evidence showing what Burke allegedly had to lose, but it cannot ask the jury to convict him merely because he was wealthy, famous, secretive, or involved in an immoral relationship. The defense will repeatedly remind jurors that bad character is not proof of murder. This may become one of the central themes of the trial. Burke can be guilty of serious sexual crimes and still not be legally proven guilty of murder. He can be involved in hiding a body and still challenge who caused the death. He can behave in ways jurors find unforgivable and still be entitled to have every charge proven separately. That is the legal principle the defense needs the jury to accept. But it is also the principle that may be hardest for jurors to apply emotionally. The evidence involving Celeste's age could overwhelm every other issue. Prosecutors do not need to portray Burke simply as a man accused of murder. They can portray him as an adult who allegedly began an illegal relationship with a child, gained her trust, isolated her from protection, and then killed her when she became a threat. That narrative gives meaning to every piece of evidence. The messages become grooming and control. The travel becomes isolation. The pregnancy conflict becomes motive. The purchases become preparation. The dismemberment becomes concealment. The silence becomes consciousness of guilt. A strong prosecution story does more than list evidence. It connects each fact to the next until jurors feel that no other explanation makes sense. The defense must break that story apart. It may argue that the illegal relationship was real, but the murder theory is not. It may concede that Burke acted selfishly, illegally, and cruelly, while insisting that those facts cannot replace evidence of the fatal act. The attorneys may tell jurors that prosecutors are using Burke's most shameful conduct to encourage an emotional verdict. They may ask jurors to imagine the case without the celebrity name, without the graphic photographs, and without the sexual allegations. What physical evidence proves who held the weapon? What evidence proves Burke was present at the exact moment Celeste received the fatal injuries? What evidence eliminates every other person with access to the location? What evidence proves the alleged purchases were made before the death rather than after it? Those questions could be effective if the prosecution's timeline is uncertain, but they could also backfire. Jurors may conclude that the defense is demanding impossible evidence that rarely exists in private murders. A killer does not become innocent simply because nobody saw the attack. A carefully planned crime may leave no video, no eyewitness, and no identifiable fingerprints on a weapon. The prosecution may argue that Burke's alleged attempt to destroy evidence is the reason some direct proof no longer exists. A defendant should not benefit from evidence he deliberately eliminated. That argument could be devastating. If jurors believe Burke destroyed the body, cleaned the location, and concealed the remains, they may infer that he was trying to prevent investigators from proving how Celeste died. The defense would then be placed in an almost impossible position. It could argue that Burke destroyed evidence because he panicked after someone else killed her. But the more successful the concealment was, the harder it becomes to prove that alternative. This is the central contradiction in the possible defense. To explain the evidence, Burke may need to admit conduct that makes him appear guilty of murder. To avoid that appearance, he may need to deny facts the jury is unlikely to reject. A partial admission can create credibility, but it can also provide prosecutors with the final link they need. For example, if Burke admits that he dismembered Celeste's body, prosecutors can ask how he knew she was dead, where he first saw her, who was present, and why he did not call for help. Every answer creates another opportunity for contradiction. If he claims he discovered the body, prosecutors will demand details. If he names another person, that person's phone, DNA, and movements will be examined. If he says he was threatened, prosecutors will ask why no message, recording, or witness supports the claim. The defense may therefore decide not to present Burke as a witness. That is common in criminal trials. The prosecution cannot force a defendant to testify, and jurors are instructed not to treat silence as evidence of guilt. But in a case filled with unanswered questions, his absence from the witness stand may still have an emotional effect. Jurors may want to hear how a child's body came to be inside his vehicle. They may want to hear why he allegedly obtained the equipment. They may want to hear why he remained silent. The judge will tell them not to hold his decision against him. Whether they can completely erase those questions from their minds is another matter. If Burke does testify, the risk becomes even greater. Prosecutors would be allowed to cross-examine him. They could confront him with text messages, purchase records, location data, previous statements, and every inconsistency in his account. A single false answer could destroy the entire defense. A calm and convincing explanation might help him. But a defensive, evasive, or emotionless appearance could reinforce the prosecution's portrayal. This decision may not be made until late in the trial, after the defense sees how strongly the prosecution's case has affected the jury. The prosecution also faces risks. Presenting too much graphic evidence could appear manipulative. Overstating uncertain forensic conclusions could damage credibility. Attempting to conceal weaknesses in the timeline could give the defense a powerful closing argument. And if prosecutors repeatedly describe Burke as a monster instead of carefully proving each legal element, jurors may feel they are being pushed toward an emotional verdict. The strongest prosecution will not need exaggeration. It will need precision. It will need to show when Celeste entered the home, when communication stopped, when each item was purchased, when the Tesla moved, who had access to it, and how every physical finding supports the same timeline. The strongest defense will look for one unexplained gap, one missing period of time, one untested object, one unidentified DNA profile, one witness whose story changed, one message suggesting another person was present, one expert willing to say the cause or timing of a critical injury cannot be established with certainty. In a case carrying the possibility of life imprisonment or death, one credible gap may be enough to change the outcome. When this case finally reaches a jury, the prosecution will likely present it as a story of escalating control. An adult musician formed an illegal relationship with a child. That relationship continued while his public career grew. Celeste allegedly became pregnant. Arguments intensified. She threatened to reveal what had happened. Then she disappeared. Afterward, prosecutors say equipment associated with concealment and dismemberment was obtained. Her biological material was detected at Burke's residence. Her remains were eventually discovered inside his Tesla. The prosecution will argue that this was not a collection of unrelated events. It was one continuous plan. The defense will attempt to separate those events. It may accept that the relationship existed while disputing when it began or how certain messages should be interpreted. It may accept that Celeste visited the home while disputing whether she died there. It may accept that Burke knew about her death while disputing whether he caused it. And it may accept that he participated in concealment while arguing that panic after a death is not proof of murder. That strategy has one clear legal advantage. It forces jurors to consider each charge separately. The government must prove murder. It must separately prove the sexual allegations. It must separately prove the unlawful handling or dismemberment of the body. It must also prove any special circumstance beyond a reasonable doubt before those allegations can increase the punishment. A jury could theoretically convict Burke of some offenses while finding reasonable doubt on others. For example, jurors could conclude that he committed sexual crimes and participated in concealing Celeste's remains, but remain uncertain about who inflicted the fatal injuries. That would still expose him to severe punishment, but it would prevent the most serious version of the prosecution's case from being accepted in full. The defense may consider that a partial victory. For Celeste's family, however, such an outcome could feel like justice was incomplete. They may believe the person who controlled her, possessed her body, and allegedly attempted to erase what happened should be held responsible for the entire crime. That emotional conflict will remain present throughout the trial. The law requires jurors to separate evidence from emotion, but no juror enters a courtroom without human reactions. The photographs, the victim's age, and the condition of her body will be difficult to forget. The defense cannot remove those facts. Its task will be to prevent them from becoming substitutes for proof. That may be why the defense team's presentation is so important. If the lawyers appear dismissive of Celeste, jurors may stop listening. If they aggressively attack her character, they may strengthen the prosecution's argument that she was exploited by adults. If they deny obvious evidence, they may lose credibility. The more effective approach may be to acknowledge the tragedy directly. The attorneys could tell jurors that Celeste deserved protection, that the relationship should never have happened, and that the treatment of her remains was indefensible. Then they could insist that moral guilt and legal guilt are not always identical. That would allow the defense to condemn certain conduct while still challenging the murder charge. It would also help answer one of the prosecution's strongest arguments. Prosecutors may tell jurors that innocent people do not dismember bodies. The defense may respond that guilty behavior after a death can arise from fear of being blamed, fear of exposing another crime, or fear of protecting someone else. The question would not be whether the behavior was innocent. It clearly would not be. The question would be what crime that behavior proves. That distinction may sound technical, but juries are often instructed to make exactly those kinds of distinctions. A person can lie without being a murderer. A person can destroy evidence without being the person who caused the death. A person can commit one serious crime while being wrongly accused of another. The prosecution will argue that this case is different because Burke's alleged conduct is not limited to one lie or one moment of panic. The concealment appears extensive. The purchases appear purposeful. The body remained hidden for months. The victim was not taken to a hospital. No emergency call was made. No attempt was made to contact her family. And no anonymous report apparently led police to her remains. That duration may destroy the panic explanation. A panic decision can occur in minutes. A prolonged concealment requires repeated choices. Each day of silence could be presented as another act of consciousness of guilt. If Burke traveled, performed, communicated with others, or continued normal activities while Celeste remained missing, prosecutors may use that behavior to portray him as calculated rather than frightened. The defense may argue that people respond to trauma in unpredictable ways. But the longer the concealment lasted, the harder that argument becomes. Another question concerns the Tesla. The vehicle may become one of the most memorable pieces of evidence because it connects Burke directly to the location where Celeste's remains were discovered. The defense could challenge who had access to the car when it was abandoned and whether someone else could have placed the remains inside. Vehicle records may reveal when doors opened, when the car moved, where it traveled, and which phones connected to it. Modern vehicles can preserve extensive digital information. If prosecutors possess data showing Burke controlled the Tesla during the relevant period, that evidence could seriously weaken any third-party theory. If the records are incomplete, however, the defense may argue that investigators cannot prove who placed the body inside. Surveillance footage from the tow yard, nearby streets, residences, parking locations, and traffic cameras could also matter. The public may have seen only a small portion of the available timeline. The trial could reveal whether investigators traced the Tesla's movements from the Hollywood Hills home to the location where it was eventually found. Phone data may be even more important. Investigators can examine location history, cell tower connections, application records, search activity, photographs, deleted messages, and communications with other people. A search for methods of dismemberment, decomposition, cleaning blood, avoiding DNA detection, or disposing of remains could be devastating for the defense. A search made before Celeste's death could support planning. The same search made after her death could still support concealment, but it would not automatically establish who caused the fatal injuries. The timing of every digital action will therefore matter. The prosecution may use phone records to show that Burke and Celeste were together during her final known hours. It may show that Burke stopped communicating normally after she disappeared. It may identify unusual gaps in his activity or attempts to disable location services. The defense may point to activities suggesting other people were present or using devices connected to the property. Again, the battle will not be over one isolated fact. It will be over which timeline best explains all of them. Witness credibility will also be tested. Family members, friends, employees, neighbors, managers, and people who visited the residence may be called. Some may have changed their accounts over time. Trauma can affect memory. Public attention can also influence how people recall events. The defense will examine every earlier interview and compare it with courtroom testimony. A small inconsistency may not mean a witness is lying, but several major contradictions could create doubt. The prosecution may argue that minor differences are natural in a long investigation and do not change the central facts. The jury will decide which inconsistencies matter. Celeste's family could face painful questioning. The defense may ask what they knew about the relationship, whether they signed documents allowing travel, and whether they understood who Burke was. Those questions may be legally relevant, especially if prosecutors portray the relationship as entirely hidden. But the defense risks appearing to transfer responsibility from the accused adult to the victim's parents. Even if adults around Celeste made mistakes, those mistakes would not justify abuse or murder. The prosecution may emphasize that failure by one adult does not excuse the actions of another. The defense may respond that these issues matter only because they affect the accuracy of the prosecution's narrative. If family members knew more than they first acknowledged, the jury may question other claims about the timeline. Still, this line of questioning must be handled carefully. The trial will not be a referendum on whether Celeste received enough supervision. It will be about whether Burke committed the charged crimes. There is also the possibility that another witness may cooperate with prosecutors. If someone helped move equipment, clean the property, transport the vehicle, or conceal the body, that person could receive reduced charges in exchange for testimony. A cooperating witness could provide the direct account currently missing from the public evidence. But cooperating witnesses come with credibility problems. The defense would ask what that person received, what charges were avoided, and whether the witness is blaming Burke to save themselves. Jurors would be warned to examine such testimony cautiously. If the witness's story is supported by messages, location data, receipts, or forensic evidence, it could be extremely powerful. If it stands alone, the defense may portray it as purchased testimony. Burke's own public behavior may also be introduced, depending on what the judge permits. Statements, social media activity, performances, or communications after Celeste's disappearance could be used if they reveal knowledge, deception, or an effort to create an alibi. But prosecutors cannot rely on the idea that a person who appears calm must be guilty. People display grief, fear, and stress differently. The defense may object to any attempt to interpret facial expressions or public appearances as evidence of murder. That is another reason digital and forensic evidence will carry more weight than impressions. The most likely prosecution strategy is to avoid depending on one dramatic revelation. Instead, prosecutors will build a detailed chronological case. They will show how Burke and Celeste met. They will explain the alleged grooming and sexual relationship. They will establish what Celeste knew and why prosecutors believe she became a threat. They will trace her final communications. They will place her at Burke's residence. They will document the purchases. They will present the forensic findings. They will track the Tesla. And they will end with the discovery of her remains. If every stage is supported, jurors may see the defense alternatives as increasingly impossible. The most likely defense strategy is to challenge the connections between those stages. The relationship does not prove murder. The messages do not prove a plan. The purchases do not prove who caused the death. DNA does not always prove when an event occurred. Possession of a body does not automatically prove the killing. A homicide classification does not identify the killer. And shocking behavior after death does not eliminate every other possible explanation. That defense will succeed only if the weaknesses are real. Reasonable doubt cannot be built from speculation alone. The attorneys will need records, witnesses, expert testimony, or unanswered forensic questions. If they cannot provide that foundation, the jury may conclude that the defense is simply breaking one powerful story into artificial pieces. The verdict could also depend on the instructions the judge gives. Jurors may be asked to consider first-degree murder, possibly other forms of homicide, and separate crimes involving the body and alleged sexual abuse. They may need to decide whether the killing was planned, whether it occurred during another felony, and whether Burke acted to prevent Celeste from becoming a witness. Each finding could change the sentence. A conviction for first-degree murder with special circumstances could result in life without parole, or potentially a death sentence if prosecutors pursue that option. A conviction without the special circumstances could still lead to decades or life in prison. Convictions on sexual offenses and crimes involving the body could add significant punishment even if jurors do not convict on the most serious murder theory. An acquittal on murder would not necessarily mean Burke walks free. That point will be important when the public eventually reacts to the verdict. Criminal cases are not always all or nothing. A jury can reject one theory while accepting several others. But the public may interpret anything less than the maximum conviction as proof that the system failed. That is why the trial will likely produce strong disagreement regardless of the outcome. Some viewers will believe the circumstantial evidence is overwhelming. Others will focus on whether prosecutors can identify the exact moment of death and the person who inflicted the fatal injuries. Some will believe possession and concealment of the body answer that question. Others will insist that the law requires more. The jury will have to move beyond those reactions. It will have to examine the evidence under specific legal standards. Did the prosecution prove that Celeste was murdered? Did it prove Burke caused her death? Did it prove the killing was deliberate and planned? Did it prove the alleged special circumstances? And did the defense introduce a reasonable alternative supported by evidence rather than imagination? Until those questions are answered in court, Burke remains legally presumed innocent. That presumption is not a declaration that the accusations are weak. It is the rule that requires the government to prove them. For Celeste, the trial will be the final public reconstruction of a life that ended far too early. Her messages, photographs, movements, relationships, and private struggles will be examined in extraordinary detail. There is a danger that the legal battle could reduce her to evidence, but she was more than a body found in a vehicle. She was a child. Whatever mistakes she made, whatever angry messages she sent, and whatever adults failed to recognize around her, she deserved safety. The case should not become a competition over who can describe her in the most useful way. The prosecution may present her as a vulnerable witness who had become dangerous to Burke's future. The defense may present her as a troubled child surrounded by conflict and other possible suspects. The jury must remember that both sides are constructing legal narratives. Celeste herself can no longer explain what happened. That is why every physical record matters. Every message matters. Every timestamp matters. Every witness must be tested. And every expert conclusion must be examined carefully. The preliminary hearing gave the public a disturbing outline. The trial will test whether that outline can survive full cross-examination. Perhaps prosecutors possess stronger evidence that has not yet been revealed. Perhaps the digital records directly place Burke at the center of every stage. Perhaps a witness will describe what happened. Perhaps forensic experts will eliminate the uncertainty emphasized by the defense. But it is also possible that the trial will reveal gaps hidden beneath the shock of the evidence. A missing timeline, an unidentified person, a forensic conclusion that is less certain than it first appeared, a purchase that occurred after the death rather than before it, a witness whose account changes, a digital record pointing somewhere investigators did not expect. That is why this case cannot be understood only through the question of whether Burke appears suspicious. The real question is whether the prosecution can prove every essential part of its theory beyond a reasonable doubt. The body was found in his Tesla. The alleged relationship gave him a possible motive. The purchases may reveal preparation or concealment. The forensic evidence may place Celeste inside his home. But when the final witness leaves the stand, one question will remain. Does all of that prove that David Anthony Burke killed Celeste Rivas Hernandez? Or does it prove that he became involved in a terrible crime after someone else had already taken her life? The answer will determine whether the defense's most controversial distinction becomes reasonable doubt or collapses under the weight of the evidence. And until a jury hears the complete case, the most important part of this story has not yet been decided.